and it's all about argument. So the way that I work through argument is a couple of things. Like, I look at the idea of what have we learned, and we're going to continue using some of the things that we have learned through rhetorical analysis, and we're going to kind of transform that or transpose that over into argument. All right? All right. So what is our purpose for argument? So just like where for rhetorical analysis, our purpose for argument for rhetorical analysis is to show the College Board that you understand how language works, how people use language to manipulate others into this bigger understanding, right? For argument, we have kind of multiple purposes. One, we have to show the College Board that you are a well-rounded person, right? That's what argument does. One thing that you have to do is show the College Board that you are a well-rounded person. Next, you have to show them that you understand how things work together in the world. And I'll show you how we're going to do all of this through our evidence. So you have to show the College Board that, yes, I understand life outside of my 16, 17-year-old self, outside of McKinney, right? Like, I understand the bigger idea. Then you have to show the College Board that you know how to logically support a position. This is what a lot of the country and a lot of grown-ups don't know how to do. They know how to argue, but it's not intelligently arguing, right? They are not logically reasoning, right? When your parents say, I mean, it's a logical reason for me, but when your parents say, when you say, can I go to this concert on a Wednesday night at 10 p.m.? I say, no. Cooper says, why? First of all, Cooper's 11. She's not asking to go to a concert that night. But my reason is because I said so. That's not logical, right? Like, I've got to give logical reasoning. So we're going to work on that logical reasoning. Next, we have to talk about evidence and where you get that evidence from. The question that I always ask you is, what can you talk about intelligently with an adult for 10 minutes? So if I had to give you a grade on a conversation that you had to talk to me about intelligently for 10 minutes, what could you talk about? What does it mean intelligently?
You're supporting your reasoning and stuff.
You have like support for your ideas or your opinions or your reasons. Okay, Jackson? You can logically argue it. You're not talking generally. You're not repeating things that you hear in the hallway or you hear at home. You have logical reasons for how you can support these ideas, right? Now, you cannot in those 10 minutes talk to me about your personal life. Oh, there's one. You cannot talk to me about pop culture. Anything that would be on entertainment news, that is on the E channel, right? Is that whatever channel the Kardashians are? Like, right? Anybody who has a personal YouTube account, like, you cannot talk to me about any of that. You cannot talk to me about your hobbies. Turn to your partner and talk about the things that you could intelligently talk to me about that don't have to do with any one of those. Ready, set, go.
Okay, so I'm sorry, you guys don't know.
All right. How many of you have 4 or more things in your head that you could talk about. Raise your hand. 3 or more things. Jackson, I'm going to call your bluff.
Okay.
Tell me the 3 things you can talk in. We're not going to talk for 30 minutes, but tell me the 3 things you could talk intelligently about.
Well, I was in youth and government for like 4 years, so I know a lot about prison reform. I know a fair bit about the government system. I know a lot about the police system and how it works. And I also know a lot about, we did a lot of debating on gun violence and a couple other things like that.
Bragger. Good job, you pass. Okay. All right. How many of you have 2 or more things that you could talk to me about? Everybody's like, I'm not raising my hand now. How many of you could only think of 1 thing to talk about? How many of you struggled to get that 1? So here's the thing. Here's our struggle and argument. If I had you write the safety versus freedom essay last week, 2 weeks ago, you probably would have generally found your way to some kind of war or revolution, right? What y'all don't realize is y'all have a wealth of knowledge. How long have you been in school? Too long, right? You have many years ahead of you. So you have to remember all those things. So let's talk about some of those things. So where does your evidence come from? 1, it can come from history, obviously. Y'all are deep into U.S. history. That's going to probably be the first thing that pops in your head anytime we talk about some kind of argument. And that's fine, right? A lot of people leave the AP Lang test and like, I just wrote an LEQ. Like, I legit just wrote a history argument. That's fine. But when you talk about history, you have to remember multiple things. You have to remember social movements, any kind of treaties or laws that were passed. Talk about revolutions or wars. But also talk about leaders. We forget that. We tend to go pretty quickly to like wars and revolutions. We forget the treaties. We forget the social movements. We forget the individual leaders within them, right? Those are all big. Current events. This is where we struggle the most, is at current events. Because y'all don't subscribe to anything on Instagram or Snapchat beyond your friends. How many of you watch any form of the nightly news daily? Okay, so we should be watching the news in some form daily, right? I watch, and I'm not talking local news. Like, I watch the nightly news on at 5:30 with Robert Muir. I watch that starts at 5:30, comes on Channel 8, right? I watch Colbert, right? I watch John Oliver. I watch Trevor Noah. So those are satirical, right? News shows. I know they are told with a slant. I know they are told with a bias. But at the heart of each one of those news stories is the real news. It's just told with a slant, right? I have to be well informed in order to understand that it is slanted, right? But that's what I watch on the daily, not John Oliver because he only comes on once a week, right? But you guys should be watching it. On that, I am on Twitter only for the news, right? So I follow like the BBC, I follow NPR, I follow Now This, I follow Al Jazeera News, I follow all these like news organizations that give me what's happening, right? And I'm reading the articles and going back and looking at them, right? Like, those are all the things that you should be doing to be well versed in current events, right? In the spring, we will actually do a podcast study where I'm going to give you a podcast that you have to follow weekly. We will do a documentary study, right? Where we watch documentaries in class and you choose the documentary that you watch. So we will do those things in the spring once we get a little closer to the exam to where we're covering a little bit more ground, all right? But your job is, what would suck is to get there in May and be like, man, I had nothing to talk about. Right? That's the worst. It's like being at an office party and you have nothing to talk about with anybody except for, oh my God, did you see Kanye West this weekend in Houston? Like, right? Like, you have to be able to talk more than that. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Joel Osteen's church. Nobody watches the news. Nobody watches the news. Okay. All right. Next, you can also write about science. Now, this is where, like, wherever you feel like you are an expert in a field, this is where it comes in, right? So, like, if you're a science kid, then you want to look at, like, what psychology movements or psychologists do you know, or theories do you know? Sociology. What science movements? What scientists? What scientific theories? Those are all things that you can use in your arguments as evidence. So you just have to find a way to make them fit. 2 years ago, I had a kid that was like all about jazz, right? Like, he knew the history of jazz. He knew jazz influences now. He knew what, like, jazz musicians influenced current hip hop musicians, right? Like, that was his thing. So we found a way to make that knowledge work in his argument. Now, the reason why we do this, and we read the books that we read, and we study the things that we study, is because I want to make your pieces of evidence different than everybody else's in the country. What you have to do is you have to think about me, day 6, hour 7, reading the same argument essay, right? No matter what the prompt is, the country tends to write about The Great Gatsby. We're not reading it. Go watch the movie. The Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks. 9/11. Hitler. All these things that are common, most of the country finds a way to focus on those. So when I've read my 1000th paper on The Great Gatsby, right? And I get to yours and I read something that has to do with a scientific movement, and that has something to do with Jay Fryrick, who's a doctor, and has something to do with the Impressionist movement, right? And how the Impressionists had to find a new place to show their art, right? Then I'm looking at your essay and going, whew, okay, like, this is interesting. Then I'm going to tend to give you higher points because there's more variety in what you're giving me. Does that make sense? All right. Next, art or music history. If you're in art history, it's the one class that I wish I would have paid more attention to in college. Like, now, I think that class would be so interesting. Then I was like, it's an 8 a.m. class on a Monday. I'm skipping. So, with art or music history, talk about, again, movements in either one of those. Specific artists, specific musicians, specific pieces of work, right? If you know, like, how Chance the Rapper came to be popular, how he did everything independent, had no label, did everything through YouTube, right? And through SoundCloud, did everything through that, opened up, everything that he learned, he used the Chicago Public Library through their technology that they had, that they gave kids access to. Like, if you know those things, that's interesting, right? But, again, if this isn't your bag, then that's not what you're going to talk about. I'll throw out literature. Duh! You can use literature. We read nonfiction for a reason. Because nonfiction you can use in an argument because it's real. I tell you to stay away from fiction. This is why we don't read it. We will read one piece, but I'll tell you why. If you talk about fiction, you have to talk about the author's purpose in producing that piece of fiction. What happens is when people talk about a piece of fiction, they end up giving plot summary. So, if you're going to talk about Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, you have to understand what place in his life was Fitzgerald when he wrote this piece. What was he ultimately trying to say about America and the inability to achieve something, right? So you have to talk about that. What does Jay Gatsby represent in the bigger picture of our culture, right? That's what you have to look at as purpose. You can't just tell me the story of Gatsby, right? So that's where we struggle if you don't know that. Now, when we read 1984, which is fiction, right, by George Orwell, it's probably one of the most relatable pieces of fiction, especially today. We are going to cover government overreach. We're going to cover the individual over the collective. We're going to cover freedom of speech, right? So we're going to cover all these things, and we're going to look at the purpose of what Orwell predicted then and how valid and how true it is now, right? So those are all the things that we're going to use that for. But again, we're looking at the purpose of why Orwell wrote it, not the plot summary of 1984, okay? The last two categories, politics and technology. I think both can probably go under like current events. As far as politics go, God, for the love of all things holy, if you can't talk intelligently about it and you can only do personal attacks on individuals, do not write about politics. If you can talk about laws and regulations and concerns about movements within the government, new laws that are passed or laws that are changed, then you can do that. As long as you know more than what you're hearing at the dinner table and more than what you're hearing your friends talk about in the cafeteria. Because I'm sure all your friends sit in the cafeteria talking about politics. Yours do?
No.
Okay. So you just have to be mindful. Technology, again, it's that idea of like, what do you know that's happening technologically that is changing? I don't care about iPhones and the new iPhone and how much it costs. Like, that's not interesting, right? But I think in the technology phase, kind of bleeding into current events, you could talk about data collection within technology, right? And the new changes there. Okay? All right. Next, let's talk about options of organization. You ready? So I'm going to give you two options for organizing your body paragraphs. So just like in rhetorical analysis, we are starting with a T-chart. We still have our assertions. We still have our two chunks. Okay, option number one, option number two are going to still be like this. Option number one, you're going to assert something about a big idea, just like we do for rhetorical analysis. So let's go on the idea of safety versus freedom. So we could say that the average man values his individual safety over freedom, and the average man values the collective safety over freedom. So those would be my two big ideas. Make sense? Y'all with me? Somebody besides Ryan, nod at me, tell me yes. Yes, yes. Okay. So give me two things that deal with my individual safety. My safety as an individual, not the safety of the country. Collective safety would be no caffeine today. Collective safety would be the safety of the country overall. So what would be something that where I am concerned about my individual safety, that I am giving up freedoms? Okay. That would be a current event. Okay. What else? Okay. That would be another current event. Okay. What about collective safety? Where are we more concerned about collective safety than our freedoms?
Security through your airport.
Okay, so the TSA. What else? Anything historically that we can say that we are more concerned with our safety than our freedoms? Okay, so a couple of things that I'm going to say. Remember how did we organize our chunks in our body paragraphs when we did rhetorical analysis? Chronologically. So we still want these to be chronological. So probably what I would do is I would do seat belts first because it's a little bit older than the personal data. Does that make sense? So I still want these to be chronological. So Japanese, I would do the same over here. Japanese internment camps came before the TSA. Does that make sense? So what you're doing when you do that chronologically for that, one, it's purposeful organization of your evidence. Two, it shows me that your evidence or that your assertion is valid through time. Does that make sense? Okay. I would like to see a little bit more variety, and for us to do all current events is rare, but because I've fed you all those, that's what we're going to, right? But I would like to see more variety in the pieces of evidence. I'd like to see a current event. I'd like to see something from history. I'd like to see something from nonfiction, right? I'd like to see something from a podcast, right? So I'd like to see kind of some variety. If you can't, then you just write your little heart out about whatever comes to your mind. All right? All right. That's option number one. Option number one, you have a big idea with multiple pieces of evidence underneath. Okay? Option number two, same thing. We're still going to do two assertions. But let's say we're going to say something about we are more concerned about our, we're going to talk about the TSA, and we're going to talk about the American Revolution. Now again, what would I probably do here with my body paragraphs? Flip them. Because I want to go chronological. And I'm going to change the TSA to gun violence. Sorry, I lied. We still have two chunks. But now we need a seed from each. And here's what I mean by a seed. So if we generally talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and his role in the civil rights movement, or we talk about the civil rights movement generally, what happens is we are undervaluing that source, that piece of evidence, because we're talking about it generally. Look. We had the civil rights movement. Now everything's fixed. We've read that in many essays, right? So that undervalues that time period. So what you have to do is you have to find seeds of evidence. Where did I get this language? When Cooper was in 3rd grade, I picked her up in February from school, and I was like, what did you do in school today, Bubba? She said, we wrote about seeds, not pumpkins. And I'm like, it's February. Why are we still talking about pumpkins? She was like, I go, well, what do you mean? And she goes, you know, Mommy, like going to recess, that's the pumpkin. And I go, okay. She was like, the seed is that one time my friend pushed me off the monkey bars. And I go, who's a friend? Right? Mommy's going to go. I said, okay, that makes sense. So the pumpkin is that big general idea of recess. The seed is the very specific piece of evidence that was the most important during recess. It's like a microscope, right? So if we're talking about the American Revolution, I don't want a whole body paragraph telling me the history of the American Revolution. I already got that. What are two specific seeds about the American Revolution that we can relate to the idea of safety and freedom? Okay, Declaration of Independence. What else? Who else? Oh, y'all are that well versed in the American Revolution, huh? Did we read Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death"? His speech to the Virginia Convention that kicked off basically the actual fighting of the Revolution. May I read Thomas Paine? Anybody? Anybody? Nobody? No? What about like all the events that led up to the American Revolution?
I was kind of thinking of like, I know that, I don't know if this is like too general, but like people were upset because soldiers were just like coming to their houses and stuff.
Okay, what was that called?
Quartering. Okay.
What is it called?
Quartering.
The quartery?
Quartering.
Oh, like your quarters. Okay, there you go. Okay, those are specific seeds of evidence. Good. Talking about gun violence, right? You could talk about how New Zealand banned all assault rifles. Where did I learn that? On Colbert last night when he interviewed the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the youngest Prime Minister in the world.
How young is that?
She's 34. She, 36. Okay, you could also talk about how Florida banned bump stocks after the Parkland shooting. All right, so those are two options. Now, what you see is they're both good. This gives me a little bit of variety of evidence. But if you're like, man, all I could think of is really in-depth two things, then you're going to write it this way. Does that make sense? So these are your options of how you would write it. For if we were to do safety and freedom, you would be writing, or you will be writing using multiple pieces of evidence, multiple sources, right? You have the Patriot Act. You have security theater, TSAs, credit cards, medicine, you have seat belts, you have vaping, you have data collection, you have all these things, right? And then all the other things that you know in history that could relate, right? All right, let's talk about the difference between your rhetorical analysis chunks and your argument chunks. Okay, so let's look at our chunks. Guess what I'm drawing? Another T-chart. Okay, so for your rhetorical analysis chunks, what was the first part of your rhetorical analysis chunk? After you give me an assertion, what do you give me? Context and? Yep. Context and evidence. Usually for us, that was 1 to 2 or 3 sentences, right? Okay. After context and evidence, what did you give me? What comes last in your chunk? Analysis, justification. Okay, that was anywhere from, we were hoping it wouldn't just be one sentence, then we didn't find valid evidence, right, or valuable evidence. It was anywhere from 2 to 5 sentences, we'll say, depending on how much evidence you found, right, like what type of evidence you found in there. We're keeping the same idea. However, with argument, what you do not have is you do not have a piece of text to go back to, right? So you have to give me context for your evidence. This means you need to keep in mind, remember your audience. So if you're talking about, let's say, the Declaration of Independence, you don't need to give me much context, right? Your audience are teachers, college professors, and TAs, people who are late in their years of college that are helping out their professors, like as a course, right? And they're there to, they're just making money, really is what they're there for in the summer, right? So you have to remember who your audience is. Now, if we were going to use something obscure like Gladwell's David and Goliath, it's not well known, you would give me context to what the argument, what the whole book is about. You would still, I would say, even with 1984, give me like this general idea of what the book is about, right? If you were to talk to me about J. Friedrich separate from the book, you don't even have to mention David and Goliath. You can talk about J. Friedrich and who he was. Like, he was this doctor who had social issues and was brought up, blah, 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 right? And lacked this sense of empathy, right? You could talk about that. That would be context, right? This summer, I read so many essays about James Charles. Okay? So, I didn't know who James Charles was before I got there. So you have to give me context to who James Charles is and why he is going to be valid. Does that make sense? That's just the context. So that is, I would say, 1 to 3 sentences probably. Then you have to give me a paraphrase of your evidence, and this is your seed, right? So again, that would probably be 2 to 4 sentences. You with me? Because you're going to have to paraphrase directly for me, very specifically pieces of evidence. So you can't just talk generally about the Declaration of Independence. You have to talk to me about its purpose for being written, why was it written, in what context was it written, what parts of it allowed us to separate from Great Britain, from the king, right? That would be your specific seed. Remember, you don't have evidence to go back to. There are no quotes in this. Then you have to give me your justification. That's going to be anywhere from 2 to 6 to 7 to 8 sentences. And listen to me, I'm not giving you exact. I'm just saying generally, right? In your justification, you obviously have to show me why does your evidence prove, or how does your evidence prove your assertion, but you also have to show me key terms. Meaning, you have to show me, if we're talking about safety and freedom, you have to show me in the Declaration of Independence, where do you see the taking away or the giving of safety? Where do you see the taking away and the giving of freedom? You have to physically write me a statement. This shows that the collective was more concerned about their personal freedoms over their safety because they were willing to blah, 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 right? You have to draw that direct tie. Here's the problem. As a reader, I cannot infer where you are seeing the aspects of these terms in your examples. What has happened in the past is when you have written essays for your teachers, especially argument, they understand the conversations that y'all have had in class. So when you are generally referencing those things, they understand what you're talking about. I can't infer any of those connections because I don't know you. I don't know the conversations you've had in class. I don't know what you've read. I don't know anything. Does that make sense? So you have to show me where you see the key terms. Or you're just giving me a whole bunch of evidence that doesn't make sense. Good? Finally, we are going to talk about a thesis. Now, we're trying a new thesis this year, and we're going to see how this goes. But it should look familiar. For those of you that are in A-Push, this should look familiar. Okay? We're going to use the same way for now. We're going to see how this works. Okay? X is going to be like the opposition. This is some say. Some say or believe blank. A is going to be your big idea for paragraph number 1. B will be your big idea for paragraph number 2. Y will be the therefore, and then it'll be a clear position on the issue. Y'all with me? I'm working through this like y'all are, so we're going to kind of see how this works out. So we may need to craft some thesis statements together. But let me show you how this works here. So we've planned out our essay, right? And I'm going to use our first example. So here's what I'm going to write. Although our country was founded on the principles of freedom. So this is my X. The average man values his individual and collective safety over freedom. Here's my A and my B. Therefore, Macon's argument is valid. And then there's my Y. So it's a multi-sentence thesis. We're going to see how we work through this. This is new for me too, so we're going to kind of work through this. What I would say, we could also say, what like our old one would be, like Macon's assertion is valid only during times of personal or of national disasters, right? So we could do that type of thesis as well. We're going to try to work through this and see how it goes, and if we need to have Coach Beto come in and kind of work through a example of a thesis again, we can.
How, if you were like arguing for like a qualifying thing, how would you do this?
We haven't talked about qualifiers. I would like that would be my qualifying statement, right? Like the idea that the average man does value his safety over freedom only during times of national disasters, right? So then I would be like terrorist attacks. I would give 2 examples, and then natural disasters, right? Like the wildfires or hurricanes, right? I could do that. We could also put in like concessions, and we will, qualifying arguments like within our chunks.
I just mean like, how would you address like the validity of the Mencken argument? You know what I mean? Like how it says like Mencken's argument is valid, but like you're saying.
You would have to be very specific at when it is or when it is not.
Okay.
Showing how you're qualifying. Like how I said, like only in times of. Or you can say it is invalid except when personal safety is at risk. Right? We'll work on that as we get through. Yeah. All right. So tomorrow what I need you doing is I need you